Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm Jen. I am one of your hosts today, and I am joined by my illustrious colleague. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Jessikah, and I am extremely excited to be here. Thanks, Jen.
Me too. I am so excited. We are here with a real jack of all trades, a scholar, a poet, a translator, and we're here to discuss an extremely exciting book. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Jeffrey Engels, and I'm a professor at Western Michigan University, where I teach Japanese and translation. As you said, I do a little bit of a lot of different things, but I love to read and write, and my passion for books is what brought me into the world of translation. So yeah, I'm here to talk with you a little bit about Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, written by Shigeru Kayama, who was he was a science fiction writer who wrote the screenplays for the 1954 movie Godzilla and the sequel Godzilla Raids Again in 1955. So the books that I translated here are his own novelizations of the films. So they were published right about the same time as the release of the second film. So the fact that they were written by the same person who wrote the screenplays, I think, is really quite exciting. It means that they're, perhaps a little bit more, they've got a little bit more cultural value, perhaps, than some other novelizations, which, are written by somebody else. Because these were written by the actual author of the screenplay, it's really exciting to see what he wanted to do with these stories.
I had no idea that these novels existed before they kind of hit my inbox. So I'm utterly fascinated by just the fact that they're here and that they exist and that we can read them. I would love for you to talk a little bit about maybe your approach to translation, especially in terms of how you choose a project. So how did Godzilla come to you as a project?
Sure. So this is actually quite different than most of the projects that I've done along the way. A lot of my career, I've been translating poetry, and because I think poetry is really under-translated. There's not enough people reading it, and I love poetry. But I also love, really good stories. And so, my dissertation project was about literature in the 1920s and 30s, popular literature. And one of the authors that I wrote about, wrote a lot of monster stories and things like that. So I've always had an interest in monsters and these kind of, bizarre, interesting tales. The way that this particular project came to me was a little bit quirky. I was in Japan in the 2011 disasters, and lived through the Fukushima meltdown and everything. And that was an extremely stressful event. And so when I came back to America, I started teaching some classes about disaster in Japan, kind of as my own way of thinking about disaster and kind of working through it a little bit on my own. And as one of the fun things that I decided to do in that class, I decided to show the Godzilla movies, like the original one, the one from 1954. I think a lot of people and maybe some listeners are really familiar with later films, but the very first film from 1954 was a very kind of deeply moving meditation on the fear of nuclear weapons and atomic weaponry, radiation. And of course, the Japanese had lots of experience with that after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So anyway, I was showing this the 1954 film over and over to my students, in these different classes, and I kept on noticing that in the credits there was this line that really intrigued me, like, based on the work of Shigeru Kayama, and I'm like, based on the work of Shigeru Kayama, I recognized his name as a famous science fiction author. from Japan, but I didn't know the novels either. So I looked into it, and I didn't have to go very far because these novels have been in print, reprinted multiple times since the 1950s. They're in print currently in a very inexpensive paperback edition. So I got them and I read them and I was like, oh my God, yeah, someone's got to do this. How has someone not done this before with all the Godzilla fans out there in the world, you know? So, so it was really exciting. I proposed it to the press, and the press very quickly said, "Yeah, let's do that." So I'm really happy about it, and I'm really happy with how the book turned out.
So I have a question, just sort of regarding translation and context a little bit.
Sure.
So when you are translating, first of all, I mean, when were these novels originally published again? Just
So they were originally published in 1955. So right about the time that the second film came out.
so I guess my two questions regarding that are, number one, did you find that, you know, you had some sort of trouble with context as far as certain parts of it dating itself while you were translating it? And also, um, when you're looking to translate something from Japanese to English in general, what are some of the biggest challenges, especially dealing with cultural differences, certain nuances, certain turns of phrase? How do you tackle that?
Yeah, yeah. Oh boy, those are two really good questions. So about the first part, the one of the challenges that I had in in terms of like cultural distance and kind of historical distance on the text was that you know the story is set in contemporary times, the time that it was written, so 1950s. When I started translating the book, I immediately there are lots of names of government agencies in this book, like the let's see, what are they all, like the Japanese Coast Guard and things like that. So there are. When I first started translating it, I used the kind of modern terms, the modern official translations of all those organizations, and I showed it to a friend of mine who was an expert in Japanese history, and he said, no, actually, the official English translation of this government agency has changed multiple times over the years. And so I had to go back and research like what terms were actually used for each of these government agencies in the 1950s, not now. Sometimes English translations were different. So so that kind of took me down an interesting rabbit hole. And yeah, so I wanted to get it right, and I wanted to make it seem as if the book wasn't written yesterday. I wanted to make it feel like it came from an older point in time. That is a challenge because of course I'm a child of the late 20th and or early 21st centuries, and so I don't speak in the way that a 1950s person did. So I had to adjust my diction and so on along the way. As for the second question about considering cultural context and things, fortunately, there weren't a lot of cultural problems in this text that really bothered me. Like for instance, some years ago I translated a book which was about a boy growing up in very rural southern Japan, and there was lots of discussions of kind of the traditional gods that he prayed to, the architecture he lived in, and so a Western reader who's not necessarily familiar with Japanese religion or traditional Japanese architecture. Might not necessarily be able to envision, the things that he was describing. This book actually was less challenging in that regard because all of the characters are living in Tokyo, a modern city. There's not too many elements of traditional Japanese culture in the book, so I didn't find as many places where I felt like there would be, kind of cultural gaps. So that made it a lot easier. But there were some places where I did add notes to the end of the book. Like for instance, when Godzilla tramples through Tokyo, he destroys all kinds of famous buildings. And Japanese readers and Japanese moviegoers would definitely know these buildings. They would, like, for instance, in one place he tramples on the Japanese Diet Building, which is like the equivalent of Congress in Japan. Like it's kind of like the parliament. And so, I felt like, the official translation of that building is the Japanese diet. And so, I figured that maybe not every reader might know what the Japanese diet is. So I did add a glossary at the back that kind of explains, what some of these places were, why they were significant, and maybe what role they might have played in the story, maybe why the author might have decided to have Godzilla stomp on those buildings in particular. So I tried to fill in kind of those cultural gaps a little bit at the end using a glossary and things like that.
I have another translation-oriented question. I was very curious to hear that you moved from translating poetry into translating prose, because it occurs to me that like poetry might be a little bit harder because you have to get a little bit more metaphorical and all these things. And I'm wondering, what was it like moving from poetry to prose, and did you have to try new translation strategies in changing form?
Well, actually, I had done some prose
Oh,
before, and so I've been moving back and forth a lot, but I've spent a lot of time in poetry. I got to say, I've never translated though a young adult book before, like a book that was geared towards teenage readers. And so that was really fun. I've got to say that that a lot of it was very straightforward, especially the parts, when Godzilla's stomping through Tokyo, he smashed this building, roar, a lot of the things were fairly straightforward. But there were some interesting challenges, like that I had never experienced in poetry before. One of them is that this book is it's very visual. There's a lot of visual description, what's going on, but there's a lot of sound related description as well. Like there are places in the book where, especially when Godzilla's stomping through and destroying a lot of things, that we hear all kinds of sounds. Practically every sentence in certain parts of the book have a sound in it, like the crash of a building, or the roar of the monster, or something like that. And so I had to figure out what to do with all these sounds in English. Japanese actually has a very, very, very rich vocabulary for sounds, actually much richer than English. There's many, many, many onomatopoeias in the Japanese language. And one example that I like to give, and one that occurred over and over again in this book, was onomatopoeia meri meri, which means it's like the sound of something crumpling up, like the fender of a car crumpling up. Or the sound of a building kind of crashing down, like one layer crumpling upon the one below it. And, the word meri meri, it's a perfectly ordinary word in Japanese, but I couldn't really think of something like that in English. And so, yeah, I had to be a little bit creative. I wanted to maintain all of the sound that was in this book. I didn't want it just to be kind of flat visual description, but I also didn't want to kind of reduce all the onomatopoeias to just crash, boom, kapow either. Although that's fun, it's the Japanese vocabulary there is very rich. So that was a struggle that I've never really had before when translating poetry. And so that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to think about that. I went back and I read some manga, which are filled with lots of kind of sounds, to get some kind of inspiration for different kinds of sounds that I could put in the text.
I have one question about sort of the ways in which reading the novels sort of like change my perspective on a lot of what like the films present. So for instance, I reading the book, I was taken in a way by like the American presence like in the book, and it occurred to me that in the book it is like a lot more overtly colonial than it feels like in some of the movies to me, like just the presence of American characters and stuff like that. So yeah, can you talk about maybe like what you feel like reading the novels adds to the experience of watching the films?
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting is that when Kayama sat down and he turned this into a novel, he kind of refocused the attention of the story. He collapsed two of the major figures in the film into one character in the novel. And like in the of people who are familiar with the film know that there's a love triangle in the story between the, this woman who is the daughter of the paleontologist and is, uh, and then a kind of a mad scientist like character, and another kind of young man who is really passionate about trying to save the world. So in the story, this love triangle has been kind of just reduced to a love dyad, I guess. And the young woman who's the daughter of the paleontologist, and a teenager, a young man who's maybe in his late teens. And I think that Kayama made that decision to do that because he was writing for a young adult audience. It made sense to have the main character be someone probably close to the same age. But that also kind of raised a really interesting question. Like in the novel, it really seems like Kayama is trying to suggest something about the ways that different generations of like the war generation and the post-war generation, like differ in their outlooks on science. One of the big themes of this book are, what are the ethical responsibilities of scientists? Should Godzilla be saved so that people can study him, or should Godzilla be destroyed in order to save people's lives? And in a way, that kind of like discussion is very parallel to the discussion people had about the atomic bomb overall. Should the atomic bomb be used, or should science be used for those kind of dangerous ends? So I think that Kayama is making some really interesting points about how like a younger generation that was born after the war, reflected differently on an older generation, and that comes through. Really clearly in the book, but I'm not sure it kind of had the same sort of generational implications that it did in the film. And as you said, another thing, the presence of America. You're right. America is never really mentioned anywhere in the 1954 film. But it is true that from 1945 to 1952, immediately after World War II, Japan was occupied by the Allied powers, who basically controlled the Japanese government. So when the film was made in 1954, Japan had basically been independent again for only a very short time. And everyone still remembered, and everyone was still aware of the fact that there were still American military bases in Japan. And in fact, there are still American military bases in Japan till this day as a legacy of World War II. But that was like so much more to the forefront of people's imagination in the 1950s, because it was still fairly new. There are multiple places in the books where people make references to America and the superpowers and stuff like that, but that doesn't exist in the film. But yeah, so the sense that America is kind of like looking over Japan's shoulder is stronger in the book, because the writer was actually quite politically astute and politically aware. I think he wanted to kind of refer to these real political realities on the ground and not just sort of let them slide by.
I feel like also the theme you were talking about earlier, this ethical theme in general comes up, in a lot of Japanese media that, I've seen myself, like a lot of the anime that I've watched, there's a lot of these ethical questions like, is it worth killing this to save this? Is there a way to save everything? And then you have these movies like Grave of the Fireflies and just this really sensitive sort of look at these topics. And I do recall one of my friends once asking me like, oh, why do you think that is? And I said, well, because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, I think you do have a unique perspective, or like to really think about these things when that happened in your backyard. So I do find that interesting, and I've always been sort of a little bit of a kaiju nerd myself. So yeah, I always I found the connection between these stories and that history really interesting. How did you get into this? Like, have you always been a fan of Godzilla? How did you find that fandom?
I do yeah, I definitely do like Godzilla, and just like so many other people, maybe you too. I watched them as a kid, and I had a lot of fun, and would pretend to stomp around, in the house, pretending to be Godzilla as a kid. Um, but I kind of put that on the back burner for a long time, and it was really later on in my career that I came back to Godzilla, because I thought it was such an interesting artifact to help us think about the ethical implications of atomic weapons, to help us think about the ways that living through Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and another incident that happened in 1954 affected the Japanese psyche. This book tells us, I think, a lot about Japanese cultural history, and that's the reason that I returned to it as a this time as an object of study, and not just as a fan. Of course, I'm still a fan, but um, uh, the thing that I just mentioned very briefly here, in 1954, the very same year that the first Godzilla was made, there was a very unfortunate incident. There was a boat with 23 Japanese fishermen on it that happened to be sailing around in the Pacific Ocean when they got caught in the blast of the hydrogen bomb testings in the Castle Bravo test in the Marshall Islands outside of Bikini Atoll. And so this was a secret hydrogen bomb testing that the US military was doing. And these fishermen were completely taken off guard. But the boat then quickly returned to Japan. Within the year, one of the guys died of acute radiation poisoning, and all the other members of the boat became sick. And this was front page headlines in Japan. First of all, because it exposed the fact that, Americans were doing the secret hydrogen bomb testing. And also it set off a kind of nuclear radiation panic in Japan, especially when people realized that some of the fish that they had been eating in Japanese markets had been irradiated by these same bombs. So 1954 was a year in which Japan was panicked by the bombs in a way that we hadn't seen actually since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is all extremely fresh in the Japanese mind when the movie Godzilla came along, and the producers and the author himself, Kayama, were very, very aware of this. Actually, if I could just could I read a passage? Is that all right? Right at the very beginning of the novels, the writer, Kayama, he includes a preface in which he talks about nuclear weapons and the problem that he wants to write about. He says this: "As you readers already know, the main character of this tale, Godzilla, is an enormous imaginary kaiju, a creature that doesn't actually exist anywhere here on the planet. However, atomic and hydrogen bombs, which have taken on the form of Godzilla in the story, do exist. They are being produced and can be used for war at any moment. If that were to happen, it wouldn't just be the big metropolises like Tokyo and Osaka that would be destroyed. The entire Earth would likely be laid waste. To prevent something so frightening and tragic from coming to pass, people all over the world are pouring their energy into a new movement opposing the use of atomic and hydrogen bombs. As one small member of that movement, I've tried to do my part in writing a novel, the tale that you now hold in your hands. Reading this book in that context will make it all the more informative and interesting." So, and he dated that July 1955. So we know that, right here in the beginning of the novels, he stakes his claim that Godzilla is a kind of anti-nuclear project, that it's one that's trying to raise awareness by giving radiation a sort of monstrous form, which would, and showing the pain that radiation can cause. So there's a lot that we can see of Japanese cultural history reflected, in this book. And again, that's one of the reasons I think it's so interesting. There's also one other really kind of fascinating moment in the story where we see like the victims of Godzilla's raid on Tokyo in a hospital, and there's a doctor kind of waving a Geiger counter over them, and feeling very sad, realizing that children have been exposed to radiation. And there's no person who would have read this in 1955 or seen the film version of it who wouldn't immediately think about the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we can kind of see the traces of how those things lingered in the Japanese cultural imagination in this book.
I was really blown away by that foreword, because I had assumed for a long time that the sort of the nuclear messaging and about the movement, I had assumed it was subtext, and it's absolutely text, which is really, really fascinating to me. I have one last question, if that's okay, about maybe how this links into your research, and if it does, because I understand that your research deals with gender, and that's what my research dealt with too. When I was a medievalist, I dealt with like crusader masculinities. So I'm wondering if, just because of the experience that you bring from your research, do you feel like this book has anything interesting to say about gender dynamics at the time?
Actually, that's a really interesting question. No one's ever asked me that before. Wow, thank you for the smart question, Jen. One of the things that one of the places in this book that I'm not 100% satisfied with is that the book really reflects extremely 1950s images of kind of how men should behave and how women should behave. And yes, I know that Kayama was writing with largely a young male audience in mind, but the female character seems relatively flat, I think, by modern standards. It's really the men who are doing kind of all the the heavy lifting. They're doing the fighting of Godzilla. They're doing the research. They're doing the science. They're going before Congress, the Japanese Parliament, to talk about the destruction and so on. So yeah, I think this does tell us a little bit about gendered roles in 1950s Japan, and I feel like we've come a long way since then. I suspect that now, if we were to have a new updated version of the story, there would be women researchers and women scientists involved. Just as a little aside, after the Fukushima meltdown in 2011, a few years after that, there was an updated version of Godzilla, the film, that was released in Japan. It was called Shin Godzilla, and it's available in this country too. You can stream it. But it kind of pretends that this first Godzilla didn't exist, and so it retells the entire story happening in the 21st century, and with 21st century technology and so on. And it's really interesting that the writers of that film decided to make women really core to the story. They're trying to correct the gender imbalance that they saw in this older text, and of course that makes me happy.
So just out of curiosity, I mean, that sounds like a reboot to me. Did you enjoy Shin Gojira yourself?
I did. I thought it was really, really interesting. And one of the things that they did in the reboot, the Shin Godzilla, is that they made sure that all of the technology was very modern looking. The people were taking images of the destruction with their cell phone and sending messages back and forth, and they really tried to think about like what a disaster would look like if it happened in the 21st century. And there was a lot of places in which they reflected on things that actually happened in the Fukushima meltdown. Like there was a very famous press conference in which the Prime Minister of Japan was saying something, and then someone came onto stage and corrected him and saying, no, the information that you just said is not exactly right. And so they imitate that, in the film. And so there's a lot of ways in which I think that the new reboot was really smart and did a really fantastic reflection on where we are today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really wonderful. And, I'm very excited for folks to finally get to read these books in translation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. It's been really a joy talking to the both of you.
Oh, thank
It was
you.
a lot of fun. Yeah.
All right, listeners, please pick up Godzilla and Godzilla Raids in one volume. They're really, really fun books, and they are a fascinating glimpse into a very particularly interesting time period in history. By the time that you hear this, they'll be available. So go hit up your library, your bookstore, wherever you like to get your books. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.